In a Connecticut field in 1999, a woman in a nightdress watched her Georgian country house burn to the ground. She was 47 years old, and she had nothing left to grab. But only 6 years earlier, she had been the most photographed hostess in New York, the wife of the most feared man on Wall Street, the queen of Nouvelle Society, a 16-room duplex on Park Avenue, 3 Manet paintings, her own fashion house, the presidency of the CFDA, then a quiet divorce, a new wife on his arm, and a slow, deliberate erasure of her name from every guest list she had once written. This is the story of Carolyne Roehm, the woman who built the most beautiful room in 1980s America, and who learned, the moment her husband closed the checkbook, that none of it had ever belonged to her. If you watch this channel for the stories the polite biographies leave out, hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. I have been working on this set of 1980s stories for a long time, and Carolyne is one of the quietest and one of the most revealing. Chapter 1. The Schoolteacher's Daughter Who Studied Society. Like a language. Jane Smith was born in a Missouri town so small that the social rules she would later master in New York might as well have come from another planet. The town was Kirksville. It sat in the rolling farm country of the northeastern corner of the state, 200 miles north of St. Louis, and in 1951, the year of her birth, it held perhaps 15,000 people. Her father was the principal of the local high school. Her mother was a schoolteacher. The house was small. The income was steady. The view from the front porch ran to soybeans. She was an only child, and from a very early age she behaved as if she had been born into the wrong picture. She drew dresses on the backs of envelopes. She cut clothes for her dolls from leftover dressmaking scraps. She watched television and noticed, in the way only a certain kind of child notices, that the women on the screen moved their hands differently from the women in her mother's bridge group. By the time she was 12, she had taught herself to sew on her mother's old singer. By the time she was 16, she was making her own prom dresses. Her mother would later remember her as a girl who never wanted to be told what to wear. She also studied. The schoolteacher's daughter did exactly what schoolteachers' daughters were supposed to do. She earned the grades, she wrote the essays, she read the magazines that came in the mail. The magazine she read most carefully was Vogue. Her mother bought it occasionally and saved the copies. Jane read each issue several times, and what she was reading was not the fashion. She was reading the captions. She was reading the names. She was studying who was photographed at which gala, in which dress, and who was standing next to whom in the small black and white pictures at the back of the magazine. She was learning, before she could afford a single ticket of admission, the map of a world she intended to enter. She left Kirksville for Washington University in St. Louis, where she enrolled in the fashion design program. She graduated in 1973 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts. The diploma in her hand was, by the standards of the world she planned to walk into, almost meaningless. The girls she would compete with had degrees from Vassar and Sweetbriar and Smith, or they had no degrees at all because their fathers had Whitney money and they did not need them. She had a diploma from a Midwestern university and $300 in savings. She bought a one-way ticket to New York. She arrived in Manhattan in the autumn of 1973. She found a sublet on the east side, the rent of which she could barely make. She talked her way into an interview at the Cosper studio. She worked there for a few months. Then, through the kind of doggedness that the Vogue captions had not warned her about, she found her way to Oscar de la Renta's studio. She was hired in 1974 as an assistant designer. She was 23 years old. She also, around the same time, married a young man named Axel Roehm. He was a member of the Roehm family of Darmstadt, the German chemical dynasty behind the company that bore the same name. The marriage was short, never publicly explained in detail, and ended in divorce inside a few years. Jane Smith of Kirksville, Missouri, walked out of it with a hyphenless German surname that sounded like an old name in any language. She kept it. By the time the divorce papers were dry, she was no longer Jane Smith. She was Carolyne Roehm. The choice of name was the first signal of who she had decided to become. She was no longer a schoolteacher's daughter from Missouri. She was a designer with a European last name and an apprenticeship in the studio of the most important American fashion designer of the 1970s. She rented a small apartment. She wore Oscar de la Renta samples to events she could not otherwise afford to attend. She learned, day by day, the codes of the rooms she had only read about in the captions. Oscar de la Renta would later say of her, in interviews given decades after, that she was the most observant assistant he ever had. He meant it not as a comment on her tailoring, but as a comment on her social intelligence. She watched, she copied, she did not embarrass herself. She had, by the end of her 10 years in his studio, made herself fluent in the language of a world she had not been born into. The fluency was so total that almost nobody she met after 1980 would have guessed where she had started. She had taught herself society the way a graduate student teaches herself German. She had memorized the irregular verbs. She had read the literature. She had practiced the accent until she could pass at any embassy dinner. What she had not yet understood, in that autumn of 1980 when she was 29 and at the top of her assistant career, was that fluency in a foreign language is not the same as citizenship. The natives can still send you home. Chapter 2. The Banker with the Quiet Hands, and a $20 million engagement gift. She met Henry Kravis at a party for very rich men, and within months he had paid for a fashion house bearing her name. The party was, by the most consistent retelling, a charity event in 1984, at which Oscar de la Renta was a sponsor, and Carolyne Roehm was attending as part of his entourage. Henry Kravis was there, escorted by another woman entirely. Kravis was 40 years old. He was already wealthy by any normal measure, and, more importantly, he was already on the cover of trade magazines as the man who was changing American corporate finance. He stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall. He wore his suits with the slightly compressed energy of a man who knew he was the most important person in any room he entered. He did not look like a movie star. He looked like the person who paid the movie star. He noticed her. The version of the story she has told in interviews over the years is gracious. The version Henry Kravis's biographers have told is more direct. He saw a tall, thin, perfectly groomed young woman across the room, asked who she was told, and decided that he wanted her. He was, at that moment, in a complicated position. His first marriage, to a New York woman named Helene Schulman, had ended in 1976. He had 2 sons by that marriage. He had been quietly single, by the standards of his class, for several years. He was looking, although he would not have said so, for the next wife. The next wife had to be presentable in any social setting his business now required. She had to be photogenic. She had to be ambitious enough to manage the role and submissive enough to accept it. Carolyne Roehm was all of those things, and one more. She was a working designer with her own apprenticeship under one of the most respected men in fashion. She was, on paper, a near-perfect candidate. They began seeing each other in 1984. They were photographed together at a few events. The fashion press noticed. The financial press noticed slightly later. By the end of that year, the wedding date had been set. They married in 1985. The wedding was small by the standards of Nouveau society. It was held in his Upper East Side apartment. It was officiated by a judge. There were perhaps 40 guests. The bride wore a dress of her own design. The groom wore a dark suit. Photographs were tightly controlled. The press release came out the following morning. 3 years later, GQ magazine, in a retrospective on the great weddings of the 20th century, would list the Kravis-Roehm marriage alongside the wedding of Prince Charles and Diana Spencer, on the grounds that it had inaugurated a particular kind of American social fame. The comparison was probably overstated at the time, and absurdly overstated in retrospect, but it captured something true. The two of them, walking into a room together in 1986 or 1987, were the publicly recognizable face of a new kind of American money. The same year as the wedding, Kravis funded the launch of Carolyne Roehm Incorporated. The seed money was, by the most consistent reporting, approximately $20 million. It was not described in public as seed money. It was described as her business. The press releases said she had founded a fashion house. The trade press said that the famous financier's new wife had opened a couture line. The truth, which both of them knew, was that she had been given a sandbox the size of a Midwestern factory and told to play. She did not play. She worked. She designed 2 full collections a year. She personally selected fabrics. She sat through fittings. She gave the customers her time. She built, in a few short seasons, a customer list of women whose husbands paid for everything they wore. The dresses ranged in price from roughly $2,000 for a simple cocktail piece to $20,000 or more for the embroidered ball gowns the most lavish hostesses required. Bergdorf Goodman carried her. Neiman Marcus carried her. Saks, Fifth Avenue, carried her. What no public account at the time mentioned, and what only became visible later in the trade press post-mortems, was that Carolyne Roehm Incorporated never operated at a profit. The overheads were enormous. The customer base was tiny. The press was respectful, but cool. The reviews, when they came, often described her work using a word she came to dislike. The word was correct. Her dresses were correct. They were also, by the rougher reading, what a society wife with $20 million and a mentor named Oscar de la Renta would make. They were not, in 1987 or 1988, the dresses that any other working designer of her generation would have made. They served a single small market. They served it well. The business burned through her husband's seed money at a steady rate. He did not seem to mind. The fashion house was, for him, a strategic asset of a different kind. It put her name on dresses photographed in Vogue. It put her face in trade press. It gave him a wife who could be described in the social columns as a designer rather than as a banker's wife. It produced, in the language his world used in private, optical returns rather than financial ones. The marriage, in the same way, was a strategic asset. He had not bought her with the engagement ring. He had bought her with the $20 million he had put into the company that carried her name. The price of the marriage, in 1985 dollars, was approximately what she would have earned in 300 years as a working assistant at Oscar de la Renta. Neither of them said this aloud. Neither of them needed to. Chapter 3. The Queen of a Room. She did not own by 1987. She stood under 3 Manet paintings in a 16-room duplex on Park Avenue, and Vogue called it her drawing room. The address was 740 Park Avenue. The building was an Art Deco limestone tower at the corner of 71st Street, completed in 1929, and considered by the 1980s as the most exclusive cooperative address in Manhattan. The Kravises occupied a 16-room duplex. It had been almost entirely acquired and redecorated in the 2 years since the wedding. The decorator was Albert Hadley of Parish Hadley. The art consultant was a discreet figure from the Wildenstein orbit. The budget for the project was, by the most reliable contemporary press estimates, somewhere between $15 and $25 million on the apartment alone, not counting the major paintings. 3 Manet canvases hung in the principal room. Several Monets and a Renoir were placed throughout the apartment. The dining room held a Major John Singer Sargent portrait of a woman in white. The library held 2 early Cézannes. The bedroom held a Vuillard. The total value of the paintings, in 1987 dollars, ran above $100 million. The vast majority were in Kravis's legal title alone. The most prominent of them had been bought through dealers Kravis had retained since the late 1970s. The art consultants did not work for Carolyne Roehm. They worked for her husband. She presented the room as if it were hers. She received guests at the entrance hall. She walked them through the long enfilade of public rooms. She paused at each picture and named the artist, the period, the small biographical fact about the painter that made her hosting feel personal rather than recited. She did this several nights a week for years. The room she walked them through was, in retrospect, the single most photographed private interior in New York between 1986 and 1992. It was published in House and Garden. It was published in Vogue. It was published in Architectural Digest. It appeared on the cover of Town and Country. It appeared in the famous 1988 Vanity Fair photograph by Helmut Newton, behind the Kravises as they posed by the fireplace. In that photograph, he wears a dark double-breasted suit. She wears an emerald silk taffeta gown of her own design. The 3 Manets are visible above the mantel. He is looking at the camera. She is looking at him. The image was reproduced in glossy magazines on 3 continents for the following 18 months. It is the image, more than any other, that fixed the Kravises in the public imagination of the period. The room that surrounded them in the photograph was the center of what the writer Tom Wolfe was in real time naming. His novel, The Bonfire of the Vanities, had come out in 1987, and one of its key inventions had been the figure of the social X-ray. The social X-ray was the very rich Manhattan wife of the late 1980s, conspicuously thin, conspicuously dressed, conspicuously hostessing. Wolfe never used Carolyne Roehm's name. He did not need to. The journalist Liz Smith and the photographer Bill Cunningham named her almost weekly. Vanity Fair named her in a long profile in 1988 by Maureen Orth. that included the words "Steel Magnolia" in the title. The phrase entered her press identity and never left. The pattern of her week was as photographed as the room. On Monday, she lunched at La Grenouille, or Cirque. On Tuesday, she met fabric suppliers at her studio on West 37th Street. On Wednesday, she hosted a charity board meeting at the apartment. On Thursday, she dressed for the night's event. On Friday, she or her husband flew to Connecticut. The country house was Weatherstone, a 1765 Georgian mansion on roughly 60 acres in Sharon in the far northwest corner of the state. Weatherstone had been bought by Kravis and converted into a country house for the marriage. The gardens, at her insistence, ran to several walled rooms with seasonal beds, modeled on English garden plans she had been studying for years. The pace of her hostessing during this peak was relentless. Conservative reconstructions from the social columns of the period suggest that she planned somewhere between 80 and 120 private dinners a year, plus another 20 to 40 charity events at which she was the hostess of record. Each dinner required a seating chart. Each seating chart was discussed in advance with her husband, who specified which deal partners and which museum trustees were to be placed where. Each dinner required a menu approved several days in advance. Each dinner required flowers. The flowers, more than any other element, were Carolyne Roehm's particular signature. The flowers were never small. The flowers were never neutral. The flowers were enormous masses of seasonal blooms arranged at scale across the center of the table. For the 1988 Metropolitan Museum gala she chaired, which the New York Times described as one of the most lavish private dinners ever held inside the museum. The flowers totaled, by her own later count, more than 3,000 cut stems. Each guest had an individual hand-painted menu. Each place card was scented. Each napkin was monogrammed. The dress she wore that night, the strapless emerald taffeta of her own design, was photographed for the cover of Town and Country the following month. She was at the absolute peak of what she had set out to do. She was the most photographed hostess in New York. She was the president of the CFDA. She was the wife of the most famous private equity figure in America. She was 37 years old. Her face appeared on the social pages every week. Her dresses were carried in the most expensive stores in the country. Her dinners were the dinners that the social columns described as the dinners. She was, by every measure the world she had walked into recognized, the queen, and not a single object in the room she received her guests in was registered in her name. Chapter 4. The Fashion House Built. On a husband's check, the dresses she designed were carried by Bergdorf Goodman, photographed in Vogue, and quietly costing her husband $16 million over 6 years. The mechanics of Carolyne Roehm Incorporated have only been honestly described in the trade press post, mortems that came after the company closed. While it was operating, the press treated it the way the press treated every other socially adjacent fashion house, which was respectfully and at a slight, polite remove from the question of profit and loss. The press treated profit and loss as something so vulgar that the company should not have to discuss it. The numbers, when reconstructed from later reporting, told a consistent story. The company was launched in 1985 with approximately $20 million in startup capital from Henry Kravis. The studio was in a midtown loft on West 37th Street. The staff peaked at approximately 35 employees. 2 collections were produced each year, plus a smaller resort collection and a custom bridal capability. The dresses, as has been noted, were priced from roughly $2,000 at the entry end to $20,000 and above for the top embroidered evening pieces. Wholesale revenue was carried by Bergdorf Goodman, Neiman Marcus, Saks Fifth Avenue, and a small number of specialty boutiques in Palm Beach, Beverly Hills, and Dallas. The revenue model never balanced. The dresses required couture-grade construction. The fabrics ran to silk taffeta, silk satin, silk velvet, lace from Calais, and embroideries from Lesage in Paris. The cost of goods on a single embroidered evening gown ran, by reasonable reconstruction, to between $4,000 and $7,000 before any overhead. The wholesale price recovered the cost of goods and a small margin. The overhead, including the studio, the staff, the showroom, the runway shows twice a year, the lookbook photography, and the press relations, ran to several $1 million annually. The customer base, the women who paid the full retail price, numbered probably no more than 300 globally. They were the hostesses Carolyne Roehm herself socialized with. They included Susan Gutfreund, Mercedes Bass, Ann Bass, Pat Buckley, and Blaine Trump. They included a handful of Texan and Californian wives. They included 2 or 3 royal customers from the Middle East. 300 customers, each buying perhaps 4 or 5 pieces a year at an average retail price of $7,000 or $8,000, generated, at full sell-through, approximately $10 million in retail revenue annually. The wholesale share of that, after the stores took their margin, was perhaps $4 to $5 million. The overhead and cost of goods together ran ahead of it. The company lost money every year of its life. The losses were absorbed by Henry Kravis. By the spring of 1991, when she would later announce the closure, the cumulative losses since founding ran, by the most consistent reporting, to between $15 and $20 million. Kravis's $20 million seed had been almost entirely consumed. He did not appear to care. The fashion house was, for him, a long advertisement for the wife rather than a business expected to clear its overhead. He had paid more than that for other forms of social positioning in the late 1980s. The art collection had cost more than 5 times the fashion house losses. The duplex had cost 3 times. The buyout retainers and the political donations and the philanthropic commitments together were a multiple of the fashion house losses in any given year. For Carolyne Roehm, the experience inside the building she worked in 5 days a week was significantly less serene than the photographs in Vogue suggested. She was the founder of a money-losing business that her husband was funding. She was also, simultaneously, the president of the trade association that judged her work. Several designers of her generation, including Donna Karan and Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren, were running profitable houses of vastly larger scale. The trade press never said in print that Carolyne Roehm was a kept designer. The trade press did, in occasional asides, note that her staff were paid above industry standard, that the shows were more expensive than they needed to be, and that the press packets were the most elaborate in New York. The implication was clear enough to anyone who could read between the lines. She felt the implication. The interviews she gave in 1988 and 1989 and 1990 contain a consistent low note of defensiveness. She insisted that she designed the dresses herself. She insisted that the company would, in time, become independently profitable. She insisted that she had not married Henry Kravis to start a fashion house. She insisted that she had been working in fashion before she met him. All of these things were true. None of them mattered. The world she was speaking to had already decided what she was, and the world she was speaking to was paid for by her husband. She worked harder. She was at the studio by 9 in the morning. She did not leave before 7 in the evening, on the days when she was not flying somewhere. She personally cut some of the patterns. She personally approved every fitting. She brought her assistants and seamstresses small Christmas gifts she had wrapped herself. She gave interviews to small magazines as readily as to Vogue. She showed up at the trade events. She paid her bills on time. The harder she worked, the more visible the loss became. The Vogue spreads were beautiful. The reviews from the New York Times were polite. The press packets were the most elaborate in the industry. The customer base did not grow. The press did not become enthusiastic. The reviewers continued to use the word correct. She had built, by the end of 1990, the most carefully made wardrobe in the social X-ray world and the most expensive fashion experiment in the country. Both of them were running on her husband's account. She had, in the same period, also built something else that the photographers did not photograph. She had built, in the daily run of her studio, the only piece of her life that she was actually doing herself. She designed the dresses, she made the calls, she ran the meetings, she read the receivables. She knew the seamstresses by name. She knew the embroidery houses in Paris by name. She knew the silk mills in Como by name. When the company closed, that too would go. Chapter 5. The Year. She held the whole calendar in her hands. In 1989, she became president of the CFDA, and the same season Henry Kravis closed the largest buyout in American history. The CFDA, the Council of Fashion Designers of America, was the trade body that organized the official American fashion calendar, ran the most important industry awards, and represented American designers in policy and trade discussions. It had been founded in 1962 by the publicist Eleanor Lambert. Its presidents since founding had included Bill Blass, Oscar de la Renta, and Mary McFadden. The presidency was not paid. It was a marker of status. It was decided by a unanimous board vote, conducted in private, and announced as an accomplished fact. In January of 1989, the board unanimously elected Carolyne Roehm to succeed Oscar de la Renta as president. She was 37 years old. She was the youngest president the organization had had. She was also, almost certainly, the least commercially successful designer the organization had elected to its top role. The election was understood within the industry, accurately as a transfer of patronage from de la Renta to his most prominent former assistant. It was also understood as a recognition that the CFDA needed access to her husband's circle of donors more than it needed her resume. She did not waste the role. She brought the CFDA's fundraising relationship with AIDS research, which had begun in a small way in the mid-1980s, to a vastly larger scale. She personally raised in her first year as president more than $4 million for the research foundations the CFDA was supporting. She organized black tie events at which her own husband and her own circle of friends were the seat holders. She brought designers and donors into conversations that had not previously included one another. She also, in interviews of the period, gave the AIDS fundraising work the most personal language she ever used in public. She did not consistently moralize it. She named names of designers who had died. The same season she was running the CFDA, her husband was running the largest corporate deal in American history. The RJR Nabisco buyout had begun in October of 1988, when the company's chief executive Ross Johnson proposed taking the company private for around $17 billion. KKR entered the bidding within days. The contest ran through November, with multiple bidders and a constant churn of investment banks, attorneys, and journalists. It closed on the 30th of November, 1988, with a winning bid from KKR of approximately $25 billion. It was the largest leverage buyout in history. It would not be matched in real dollar terms for another 17 years. By the start of 1989, Henry Kravis was on the cover of Time, on the cover of Forbes, and in the lead of the business sections of every newspaper in the country. The deal had made him, on paper, a billionaire. It had also made him, in cultural memory, the personification of a particular kind of 1980s American capitalism. The journalists Brian Burrow and John Helyar were already at work on the book that would, the following year, name the era. The book was Barbarians at the Gate. It would be published in 1990. It would sell more than 500,000 copies in hardcover. It would fix Henry Kravis in the public mind for the rest of the century. Carolyne Roehm, in the same season, was hosting the Metropolitan Museum gala. The gala fell in the spring of 1989. She chaired the dinner, she chose the menu, she designed the place settings, she wrote the seating chart, she approved the floral arrangements. She wore, that night, a black silk velvet evening gown of her own design, set off by a single emerald necklace borrowed from a Bond Street jeweler for the night. The photographers placed her on every list of the most photographed women of the season. The marriage was, that season, operating on two of the largest cultural stages in the country at the same time. He had built the largest deal. She had built the largest dinner. The press treated them as a single phenomenon. The phrase nouveau society had not yet acquired its later, slightly contemptuous edge. The phrase the new establishment, used in a timepiece of the period, captured the thing the Kravises were taken to embody. They were the new establishment. They were what the new American money looked like when it dressed for dinner. What neither of them said in public, and what both of them knew in private, was that they were not the same kind of operator. He had built the largest deal because he had a partner who would walk away from the table if the numbers did not work, and a team of 15 who could pressure target boards by reflex, and a willingness, ultimately, to spend other people's money to acquire other people's companies. She had built the largest dinner because she had hired the right florist and the right calligrapher. The dinner produced no return except photographs. The deal produced billions of dollars of carried interest over the following decade. In financial terms, his work was the work. In social terms, her work was the work. The asymmetry between those two definitions of work would not begin to cost her until the social term stopped being valued. She did not, that season, see it coming. In the months after the gala and the buyout closure, she gave several long interviews to magazines about the future of American fashion. She spoke about the importance of supporting young designers. She spoke about the AIDS fundraising. She spoke about the question of whether American fashion could become a global force at the scale of Parisian or Italian fashion. She did not speak in those interviews about her own marriage. She did not speak about her husband's deal. She was disciplined. She also did not yet know that the social X-ray world was about to begin a slow contraction. The crash of October 1987 had bruised certain fortunes, but not the Kravis fortune. The recession of 1990 would bruise more of them. The press, which had treated the social X-ray world as glamorous, would begin to treat it as something else. Tom Wolfe's novel had crystallized one kind of judgment. The Burrow and Hellyer book about her husband's signature deal would crystallize another. By the time both books had finished their cultural work, the world she had spent 15 years learning to enter would be on its way out of fashion. She had less than 2 years left at the peak. Chapter 6. The Phone Call. From Colorado. On the 4th of July weekend in 1991, Henry Kravis's 19-year-old son was killed in a car wreck in Boulder, and inside 2 months, her fashion house was closed. The son was Harrison Kravis. He was the elder of the 2 children Henry Kravis had had with his first wife, Helene Schulman. He had been born in 1971. He had been a quiet boy by every account, gentle, more interested in books and music than in his father's deals. He had enrolled at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He was a student there in the summer of 1991. On the night of the 3rd of July, he was a passenger in a car driven by a friend on a road in Boulder County. The car left the road. The friend survived. Harrison did not. He was 19 years old. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Henry Kravis received the call in New York. He flew to Colorado the same day. He returned with the body. The funeral was small and private. The press was kept at a distance. The Kravis household, at every address, fell silent for weeks. Carolyne Roehm has spoken, in the very small number of interviews in which she has discussed this period, with a real grief that is not stylized. She did not have a biological relationship with Harrison. She had, in her own description, tried to build a stepmother's relationship over the 6 years of her marriage to his father. The relationship had been complicated, as such relationships often are, between a young second wife and a teenage son. She had, by her own account, been fond of him. She had not been close to him in the way his mother was close to him. She also had not been a stranger to him. The death broke something in her household that did not repair itself. It also broke something in Henry Kravis. Friends of the period reported that he became, for a season, a different man. He canceled travel. He did not appear at the office for several weeks. He spent unbroken time at home for the first time in the marriage. He grieved publicly. He spoke about Harrison in language he had previously reserved for closing dinners. In that household, in the middle of that grief, Carolyne Roehm made the decision to close her fashion house. The closure was announced on the 10th of September, 1991, 2 months after Harrison's death. It came in a press release that was tightly written and entirely composed of a single argument. She had decided that, in light of the recent family loss, she could not in good conscience continue with the planned expansion of her business, which had included a contemplated production agreement with a Paris manufacturer. She would, therefore, wind down the operations of Carolyne Roehm Incorporated, effective immediately. She would devote herself to her family. She thanked her staff, she thanked her customers, she thanked Bergdorf Goodman, Neiman Marcus, and Saks Fifth Avenue. The press release was gracious and short. It was reported in the New York Times the following day as the end of a fashion fairy tale. The Deseret News, in a longer piece a few weeks later, used the same phrase. The trade press, more honestly, noted that the company had been operating at a loss for several years, and that the death of Harrison Kravis had provided a face-saving public reason for what had become a commercially necessary closure. Both readings were true. The financial truth and the human truth were not in competition. They sat side by side. The death of the stepson was real. The losses were real. The decision was real. The press release was a frame placed over all three. What the press release did not say, but what is now visible from the outside, was that the decision to close ended Carolyne Roehm's only piece of independent professional identity. The fashion house had been the only thing in her life that was not owned in legal title by her husband. It had been, even at a loss, the only piece of the architecture that listed her as the responsible party. The staff worked for her. The customers met with her. The reviews named her. The shows were hers. The closure of the company took all of that away. What was left on the morning of the 11th of September, 1991, was a 39-year-old woman with a famous husband, a Park Avenue apartment in her husband's name, a country house in her husband's name, a wardrobe paid for by her husband, and no studio to go to in the morning. She had, in the language of corporate restructuring her husband used in his own office, become a non-operating asset. The household was still extensive. The household was still photographed. The household was still hosting. But the woman at its center no longer made anything that did not exist to serve the household. For a marriage where the wife had been valued in part for her independent productivity, this was a structural change. For a husband who treated his life as a portfolio, the change registered. It did not register on the day of the announcement. It did not register that autumn. It did not register in any way Carolyne Roehm could see for another full year. But in the years afterward, when the Manhattan press reconstructed the chronology of the breakdown of the marriage, the closure of the fashion house in September 1991 was the moment that was always identified as the structural turn. Up to that moment, she had been the working wife of the dealmaker. After that moment, she was the social wife of the dealmaker. The social wife of the dealmaker was a position with a known shelf life. Chapter 7. The Canadian Economist at the Hudson Institute dinner. While Roehm was in mourning beside her husband, a quiet woman with a Hudson Institute fellowship was already in the next room. Marie-Josée Drouin had been on Henry Kravis's professional periphery for several years before she became central to his personal life. She was born in Ottawa, Canada. She earned a master's degree in economics from the University of Ottawa in 1970. She joined the Hudson Institute in 1973 at the age of 23, the youngest senior fellow in the organization's history at that time. The Hudson Institute was a center-right policy think tank founded by Herman Kahn. It studied long-range strategic and economic questions. It published the kind of papers that members of corporate boards read on aeroplanes. Drouin specialized in economic policy and competitiveness. She wrote a regular column for La Presse in Montreal. She wrote a column for the Montreal Gazette. She wrote occasionally for the Wall Street Journal. She hosted a weekly television show in Ontario. She was, by the late 1970s, a public intellectual of a kind that Canada produced more of than the United States. She was widely read in the boardrooms of Toronto and Montreal. She was, by the early 1980s, a board member or a frequent speaker at a number of American institutions. Henry Kravis joined the board of the Hudson Institute in the early 1980s. He served on the board as a donor, as an outside director, and as a presence at the Institute's annual donor dinners. Marie-Josée Drouin was at those dinners as a senior fellow. They knew each other professionally for a decade before there was any private connection between them. The professional relationship was, by every contemporary account, entirely correct. What was happening, slowly and almost invisibly to Carolyne Roehm and to the New York social press, was a cultural shift in what the very rich of the country considered the marker of seriousness. Through the 1980s, the gala society world had been the public face of upper-class life. The Costume Institute Ball, the Library Lions Dinner, the Winter Antiques Show, the Save Venice Gala. These were the dinners that defined a person as inside the world. The press covered them. The wives ran them. By the early 1990s, that began to change. The cultural cachet of the Great Gala began to be redistributed onto a different set of institutions. Museum boards became more important than gala chairs. Policy Institute fellowships became more important than charity board memberships. University trustee seats became more important than the seating charts at La Grenouille. The men in the leveraged buyout class, who had spent the late 1980s cultivating the social X-ray world, began to spend the early 1990s cultivating the museum and university board world instead. They were, almost without exception, looking to acquire reputational durability that the gala world had not been able to give them. Carolyne Roehm could not give her husband that next layer of credibility. She had built her identity entirely inside the gala world. She had a CFDA presidency. She had a fashion house, now closed. She had a Vogue cover history. She did not have an economics degree. She did not have a Hudson Institute fellowship. She did not have a board seat at the Museum of Modern Art. She did not have a New York Times opinion piece. She had a beautifully decorated apartment. Marie-Josée Drouin had the other set of credentials. She had the Hudson Institute Fellowship. She had the columns. She had the television show. She had the academic profile. She had, more importantly, the capacity to walk into a museum board meeting or a foreign policy dinner and contribute substance to the conversation. She was, in the precise language of his world, the next wife. What the timeline of the personal relationship was has never been publicly itemized. Carolyne Roehm has never spoken about it on the record. Henry Kravis has never spoken about it on the record. Marie-Josée Drouin has never spoken about it on the record. The press reconstruction is partial. What is known is the following. Kravis and Drouin had served on the Hudson Institute board together throughout the 1980s. They had had a professional friendship over many years. By 1992, that friendship had become, by the report of mutual friends to magazine writers, something more than professional. By the early months of 1993, the separation from Carolyne Roehm was being negotiated in private. By the autumn of 1993, the divorce was final. By the early months of 1994, Kravis and Drouin were married. The compression of the timeline tells its own story. The marriage to Carolyne Roehm ended, and the marriage to Marie-Josée Drouin began inside a single span of months. There was no public waiting period. There was no extended single life in between. The portfolio rebalance, to use the language his world used, was clean. It was also, for the woman being rebalanced out of, a quiet and very fast end. Chapter 8. The Quietest Divorce. In Manhattan. The press called it friendly, but a friendly divorce in 1993 meant exactly what it had always meant in this set, which was that the wife had agreed not to publicly fight. The Kravis-Roehm separation was announced quietly through the social columns in the first months of 1993. The divorce was finalized later the same year. The settlement terms have never been publicly itemized. Both parties signed mutual non-disclosure agreements. The press releases from both sides used a near-identical and very brief language. They had decided, after 8 years of marriage, to part on friendly terms. They wished each other well. They asked the press to respect their privacy. The press largely complied. The social columnist Liz Smith mentioned the separation in a single sentence in her column. Vanity Fair did not publish a long take. Vogue did not. Town and Country did not. The trade press of fashion noted the separation as a footnote to coverage of the closed Carolyne Roehm fashion house. The financial press noted the separation as a footnote to coverage of Henry Kravis's continuing buyouts. The privacy of the divorce was an engineered product. The settlement included, as such settlements often did in that set, an agreement to not discuss the terms or the circumstances. Carolyne Roehm signed it. She did so for a reason that was, on its face, sensible. She did not have the capital to fight a public divorce against her husband. She had a fashion house that had closed at a loss. She had no separate fortune. She had a husband whose net worth had been estimated in the financial press in 1992 at over $500 million in personal holdings, and considerably more in carried interest and partnership stakes at KKR. The asymmetry of resources was total. A public divorce trial would have been a financial and reputational disaster for her, and a survivable embarrassment for him. The settlement she signed traded the right to fight in public for a guarantee of a particular kind of future. She would keep Weatherstone. She would receive a financial settlement that, while never publicly disclosed, was widely understood in the small world that knew to be in the low to mid-8 figures. She would receive a continuation of her health insurance. She would not be barred from continuing to use her name professionally. She would not be barred from using her social contacts. In exchange, she would not speak. She did not speak. What she lost in the settlement was, by inference from later visible facts, very large. She did not keep 740 Park Avenue. The apartment remained in Kravis's name and was eventually sold or transferred. She did not keep the 3 Manet paintings. She did not keep the Sargent. She did not keep the major French furniture. She did not keep the principal jewelry collection. She did not keep the corporate jet access. She did not keep, by the autumn of 1993, the membership at the Knickerbocker Club, the Maidstone Club, or the box at the Metropolitan Opera, all of which were maintained by her husband's accounts. She kept the country house, the financial settlement, her dogs, her name, and her clothes. She was 39 years old. The settlement allowed her, by the most reasonable later calculation, to live for the rest of her life as a wealthy upper-class American woman with a beautiful country house. It did not allow her to live as the wife of a billionaire. The order of magnitude difference between those two lives is not always intuitive to people outside the very top of American wealth. A wealthy upper-class American woman in 1993 with $8 or $12 million could maintain a 60-acre country house, 3 or 4 staff, a car, several flights to Europe a year, and a comfortable retirement. The wife of a billionaire could maintain all of that, and an additional $16 or $20 million of variable spending a year, plus access to private aircraft, plus access to philanthropic capital with which to chair charity galas, plus the kind of household staff that runs at 20 or 30 people. She had gone from the second tier of those two lives to the first. This was, in the published voice of the period, the kindest possible divorce a New York wife of her position could have hoped for. It was a generous and humane exit on civil terms. It was, in the unpublished voice, an exit. She was, by the standards of the world she had walked into in 1984, no longer of the place. The duplex on Park Avenue had been the center of her life. It was no longer the center of her life. The dinners at the Metropolitan Museum had been her stage. It was no longer her stage. The walls hung with Manets and Monets were no longer hers to walk her guests past. She moved her things out quietly. She did not give a long interview. She did not write a memoir about the marriage in 1993 or 1994 or in any of the decades that followed. She has to this day not publicly discussed the divorce in any detail. In her silence, Henry Kravis married Marie-Josée Drouin in 1994. The wedding was small. It was reported as a footnote in the business press. The Manhattan social columns, very politely, transferred their language about the senior Kravis wife from Carolyne Roehm to Marie-Josée Drouin within the same 12 months. The hostesses she had counted as friends quietly transferred their dinner invitations. Within a year, in the social diary of New York, she did not exist. Chapter 9. The 12 Months of Erasure. Within a year of the separation, the table she had built was set for somebody else, and no one in the room thought to mention her name. The mechanics of being dropped in the New York social world have been documented many times in the post-mortem literature of the period. The trade press has been honest about it. The literary press has been honest about it. The wives who have lived through the experience and then written memoirs about it have been the most honest of all. The mechanics work as follows. A divorce in the very small set Carolyne Roehm had been at the center of triggers an immediate informal receding across all of the social calendars she had been on. The dinner invitations she had been receiving for the autumn season do not get renewed for the following spring. The reasons given, when reasons are given at all, are gentle and apparently logistical. The hostess has decided to keep the dinner smaller this year. The seating chart has been reduced from 12 to 10. The chair on the gala dinner is taken by someone whose husband has just made a larger pledge. The board seat is up for rotation. None of the reasons are stated as what they actually are. What they actually are is that the wife is no longer in residence on the senior wife side of the marriage that the table was built around. The new wife, by contrast, enters the same calendar at the same level. Marie-Josée Drouin Kravis was placed within a few months of the wedding at the senior tables at the same charity events Carolyne Roehm had previously chaired. She was placed at the central dinners at the Museum of Modern Art, where she was already a board member, and where she would, in time, become chair. She was placed at the Library Lions dinner. She was placed at the Costume Institute ball. The seating charts that had held Carolyne Roehm now held Marie-Josée Drouin Kravis. The reassignment was, in the same gentle, apparently logistical language, complete inside 12 months. The women who had been Carolyne Roehm's social peers were not, by any reading available to her, cruel to her in this period. They were, in the language of the world, polite. They did not invite her to the dinners. They did not cut her in public. They did not write about her unkindly. They simply, with the same coordinated muscle memory the set used in every previous divorce, moved their attention. The few invitations that did come during the first months of 1994 were to events of lower social ranking. Smaller hostesses called. A few designer friends called. Oscar de la Renta, by every account, was constant in his loyalty. He continued to invite her, to seat her, to call her in private. He was an exception. He was a man, an industry mentor, and, by his own internal compass, a person not interested in the wartime logic of the senior wife transition. He was also one of perhaps 4 or 5 people in the original Roehm Kravis circle who behaved that way after the divorce. The press, in the same months, made the same transition. The New York Times social column began to refer to Marie-Josée Drouin Kravis as the wife of Henry Kravis, without further qualification. Town and Country profiled her. Vanity Fair profiled her. The cover image of the Kravises by the fireplace, the famous 1988 Helmut Newton photograph, slipped out of regular rotation in the magazine retrospectives. The new image, taken at a Museum of Modern Art event, became the iconic Kravis photograph for the new chapter. In it, Henry Kravis stands beside Marie-Josée Drouin, who is wearing a dark suit and small pearl earrings. The image is sober, professional, museum board appropriate. It is the image of a different kind of marriage. Carolyne Roehm, in the same period, made no public countermove. She did not give an interview about the divorce. She did not appear at the social events to which she was not invited. She did not publish a memoir. She did not pursue a lawsuit. She did not engage a publicist to defend her position. She did, in the quiet phrasing she has used since, move on with her life. What moving on with her life looked like, in the practical sense, was retreat to Weatherstone. She spent the autumn of 1993 and the winter of 1994 primarily in Connecticut. She gardened, she entertained quietly, at smaller dinners with old friends from outside the inner New York set. She began work on what would become her first published book, A Passion for Flowers, eventually published by HarperCollins in 1997. She accepted in herself the structural fact that the world she had spent 15 years entering would not have her back. What she had not yet seen, but what was already true by the spring of 1994, was that the position she had constructed had not survived her. The architecture had collapsed when its sole structural support, the marriage, had been removed. The dinners she had hosted were now being hosted by Marie-Josée Drouin Kravis. The flowers she had arranged were now being arranged for Marie-Josée Drouin Kravis. The dresses she had designed were no longer being designed at all. The CFDA presidency was now in the hands of her successor. The face of Nouveau society was no longer her face. The accuracy of the displacement was almost mathematical. There was no remaining variable for which she was the answer. She had been the public face of one kind of capital. The capital had been redirected. The face had been changed accordingly. She turned, with the discipline she had taught herself by reading Vogue captions at 12, toward the only resource she had left in her own name. She turned toward the country house. She turned toward the garden. She turned toward the books. She turned toward Weatherstone. Chapter 10. The Country House. She had always loved more than the city. She kept Weatherstone in the divorce, and she went there to learn what she still owned. Weatherstone sat at the end of a long private drive off a quiet road in Sharon, Connecticut, in the foothills of the Berkshires, 2 hours north of New York City. The house, built in 1765, was a Georgian frame structure with a center hall plan, low ceilings, and a wide front porch. Around it sat roughly 60 acres of meadow, orchard, walled garden, and pond. The original property had been bought by Henry Kravis in the late 1970s. He had converted it into a country house for the marriage in the mid-1980s. Carolyne Roehm had spent every season since then refining the gardens. In the settlement, Weatherstone was hers. The decision, on her part, to make Weatherstone the center of her life was not gradual. It was nearly immediate. She had stopped giving Manhattan dinners by the end of 1993. She had given up the city apartment she had once received guests in. She had taken a smaller pied-à-terre on Park Avenue for the nights she still wanted to be in town. She had moved her books, her flowers, her dogs, and her clothing to the country. She built her days around the garden. She replanted the walled garden several times in the first 3 years, settling on a design that combined an English mixed border with a more disciplined parterre. She built a kitchen garden. She built a cutting garden, so that the flower arrangements that had once been bought from the most expensive florist in Midtown could now be cut by her own hand. She began photographing the garden. She began writing about it. The first book, A Passion for Flowers, was published in 1997. It was a hardcover from HarperCollins. It contained 250 photographs. It described the gardens at Weatherstone. It taught the reader to make a bouquet by season and by feel. It was reviewed politely. It sold well, particularly to a readership of upper-middle-class American women who had watched Carolyne Roehm in Vogue in the late 1980s, and now wished to know how to fold their napkins the way she had folded hers. She had begun, very quietly, to build the next thing. The next thing was small. The next thing was real. The next thing was hers. She also, in the same period, began to articulate a private theory of taste that the gala years had not let her speak. The theory was that beauty did not have to be expensive to be useful. The flowers in her cutting garden came from heirloom seeds. The fabrics in her Weatherstone rooms were chintzes she had been collecting for years. The furniture was a mix of inherited family pieces and pieces she had bought herself at country auctions in Litchfield and Hudson Valley. The theory was a quiet rejection of the social X-ray world she had been the public face of. The theory was that one could live beautifully without being the wife of a billionaire. She did not say this aloud as a polemic. She said it in the form of arrangements of zinnias and dahlias in a milk pitcher on a kitchen table, photographed for her books. The polemic was visible to anyone who could read pictures. The dogs, throughout this period, were a continuous presence. She kept dachshunds and small terriers. She named them. She photographed them. She placed them on the kitchen sofa beside the cutting tables. They served in the slow construction of her new authorial identity the same role the spaniels of Edwardian English country writers had served. They were the visible companions of a woman who was no longer married. They were also, by themselves, a small and self-contained social world. The dogs did not require a seating chart. She did not remarry. She did not pursue another rich husband. She did not, in any of the interviews she has given over the following decades, speak about the possibility of a second marriage as a particular goal. She built, very quietly, a single life. The single life was at Weatherstone. The single life involved books, gardens, dogs, and the slow construction of a publishing brand around her own first name. By the end of the 1990s, she had published 2 more books. She had begun a small business in branded scented candles and floral arranging supplies. She had started a website. She had developed a regular readership through a quietly maintained mailing list. The Manhattan social columns, by then, had stopped writing about her almost entirely. Vogue had moved on to a new generation of hostesses. Architectural Digest, when it covered her as a garden writer rather than as a society wife. She had become, by approximately 1998, a different person from the person who had stood under 3 Manets in 1987. The new person owned her own house. The new person earned her own income from her own books. The new person was, in a strict accounting sense, not displaced by anyone, because the new person was not in a position from which displacement was possible. It was, by every reasonable reading, the first time in her adult life she had been her own employer. Chapter 11. The Field. In a nightdress. In 1999, an electrical fire ate the Weatherstone house she had loved more than her marriage, and she watched it from the lawn in her nightdress. The fire started by the report of the fire marshal in the wiring of the Upper East Wing of the original 1765 house. It started in the early hours of the morning. By the time the smoke detectors in the bedroom wing woke her up, the fire had already taken most of the upper floor. She got out of the house. She got the dogs out of the house. She did not get the books out, the photographs out, the dresses out, or the small collection of objects she had brought with her from the Kravis years and kept on shelves in a sitting room. She stood in the field in her nightdress, and she watched the original house disappear. The fire department from Sharon arrived. The fire from Cornwall arrived. The fire from Lakeville arrived. By dawn, the house was a stone foundation with a chimney standing in the middle of it. The garden, which had been on the other side of the lawn, was untouched. The greenhouse, 50 yards away, was untouched. The barn was untouched. The house itself, the only original building on the property, was gone. She did not weep on camera. The press did not photograph her on the lawn. She was, in those hours of the morning of the fire, far enough from any reporter that the moment was hers alone. The press got the story later. She gave a short statement. She thanked the fire crews. She said she would rebuild. She did. The decision to rebuild was made within weeks. She hired the architect Christian Sander to design the new house. She gave him a brief that was, by every report from people who worked on the project, unusually decisive. She wanted a pure Georgian house in the style of the original. but with the proportions she had always wished the original had had. She wanted higher ceilings. She wanted a 2-story great room as the central feature of the house, where the visitor walked in and looked straight up into the volume of the building. She wanted a kitchen large enough for her cooking. She wanted a study large enough for her writing. She wanted, in essence, a house that was designed for her, by her. The new Weatherstone was completed in 2001. The construction was photographed in process for House and Garden and Architectural Digest. The finished house was photographed for both magazines and for her own books. The press described it as a magisterial reinvention of an American Georgian. It was. It was also, more importantly to her, the first house she had ever lived in that was hers from the start. She has spoken in interviews about the fire and the rebuild as if it had been, on balance, a freedom. The original house, even in her ownership, had still been a Kravis acquisition. The architectural choices of the original Kravis renovation had not been hers. The framing of the rooms, the chimney heights, the kitchen layout, the placement of bathrooms, had all been the work of decorators commissioned in the early years of the marriage. The fire, by destroying all of that, had freed her to build a house that did not carry the fingerprints of the marriage that had paid for the original purchase. She did not say this in those words. She said something close to it. She said that the rebuilt house was the first house that felt, on every wall, entirely her own. The rebuilt house has been the center of her life since. She has lived there for approximately 25 years. She has gardened there, written there, photographed there, hosted small dinners for friends there, kept her dogs there. She has, in interviews, occasionally been asked about whether she misses the city. The honest answer she has given, in different forms, is that she misses certain people. She does not miss the dinners. She does not miss the seating charts. She does not miss the calendar. She has not missed the apartment on Park Avenue she once received her guests in. The apartment, in the years since the divorce, has had at least one other owner. The 3 Manets have been moved, sold, or rotated through other private collections. The Sargent has been sold. The world she once walked her guests through, in that long enfilade of public rooms, no longer exists as a single room. It exists as a memory. Weatherstone exists as a house she can walk through on any morning. She walks through it. She cuts the flowers. She feeds the dogs. She works on the next book. The field in the nightdress, in retrospect, was the last involuntary moment of her life. From that morning forward, everything in the Weatherstone construction was her decision. She had been displaced from one architecture. She had built in middle age, with her own hands and her own settlement, money, and her own discipline, a different one. Chapter 12. The 11 Books. She wrote without him. She never remarried, and over the next 25 years, she wrote 11 books that built, paragraph by paragraph, a life that no husband could repossess. The books came in a steady cadence. A Passion for Flowers in 1997. A Passion for Interiors in 1999. A Passion for Blue and White. A Passion for Parties. At Home with Carolyne Roehm. Presentations, Flowers. A small set of more recent volumes on entertaining, gardening, and small luxuries. The total, by the most recent count, runs to 11. They are sold in the better bookstores. They are sold on her website. They are sold to a readership that has stayed loyal to her for almost 3 decades. The voice of the books is consistent. It is not the voice of the Manhattan hostess of 1987. It is the voice of a Connecticut country writer who knows that the readers want to be told what arrangements to make for a Saturday lunch in autumn. It is the voice of a woman who has finished worrying whether the world she is speaking to is the most important world in the country. The voice is calm. The voice is direct. The voice is hers. The lifestyle brand around the books is small. There are scented candles. There are sachets. There are floral arranging tools. There is an annual gift guide. There is a small mailing list. The whole enterprise generates, by all available external indication, a comfortable middle 6-figure income on top of the original divorce settlement. It doesn't generate, and has never been intended to generate, the kind of capital that Henry Kravis generates. It generates instead a steady income that belongs to her. In the world she walked out of, the world continued. KKR became one of the largest private equity firms in the world. Henry Kravis stepped back as co-chief executive in 2021 and remained co-executive chairman. His net worth, by the published estimates of the early 2020s, ran past $9 billion. Marie-Josée Drouin became, in 2005, president of the Museum of Modern Art Board, and in 2021, the chair of that board. The Marie-Josée and Henry R. Kravis Foundation became a major American philanthropic vehicle. The couple bought the Hamptons estate at Meadow Lane that had been previously owned by the Kennedys and others. None of this would have looked plausible from the 740 Park Avenue dining room of 1987. All of it traces forward from the moment in 1993 when Roehm was removed and Drouin took her place. The architecture that had been built around Carolyne Roehm in the late 1980s was, viewed from the present, the rehearsal version of the architecture that has been built around Marie-Josée Drouin Kravis since. The Kravis house has continued to be one of the great houses of American social life. It has simply been a different woman's house. In the same period, Carolyne Roehm has kept Weatherstone. She has kept her name, she has kept her dogs, she has published her books. She has, in the latest available reporting, listed her Park Avenue pied-à-terre for $5.5 million in 2024. The listing is a small public reminder that she remains a wealthy woman by ordinary American standards. The listing is also a small reminder that she has continued to live, primarily in Connecticut. The deeper truth the story illuminates is uncomfortable for anyone who has ever tried to build social position by aesthetic excellence rather than by capital. Roehm did the entire feminine project of 1980s American society correctly. She was beautiful, thin, polite, talented, ambitious, generous, charitable, and disciplined. She was loyal. She had taught herself a foreign language to native fluency. The system she had volunteered to be the visible center of did not, in the end, value any of those things at the moment of decision. The system valued a different wife. The system retained the husband. The system replaced her with someone who fit the next chapter of his strategic life. Old money does not corrupt only those who inherit it. It corrupts those who marry into it as well. It corrupts them by teaching them to believe that the beauty they assemble belongs to them. The duplex is theirs. The art is theirs. The seat at the dinner is theirs. The presidency of the CFDA is theirs. The cover of Town and Country is theirs. The applause is theirs. The work, very often, actually has been theirs. The work and the ownership of the work are not the same thing. The work belonged to them. The ownership of the work belonged to him. The lesson Carolyne Roehm has spent the last 30 years quietly demonstrating is that survival, after the marriage ends, requires building something the husband cannot take. She built a writer's career, a gardener's life, and a country house she rebuilt herself after the fire. It is, by the measure of the world she once belonged to, a smaller life than the one she lost. It is also, in the strict sense, the first life that has actually been hers. She is, at the time of recording, 74 years old. She lives at Weatherstone. She gardens. She writes. She is not remarried. She does not appear in the social columns. She did not come back to fight. The world she lost has continued without her, in a slightly chillier light, under a different wife. The world she built, in her own name, in the country, has continued under her hand. The two worlds do not communicate. The wider history will record her, when it remembers her at all, as a footnote to the leverage buyout era. The narrower history, the history that lives in the people who have read her books and who arrange flowers on their own kitchen tables on Saturday mornings, will remember her as something else. She is the woman who learned, at 39, that the beautiful room she had built around her husband had never belonged to her. She is also the woman who built, in middle age, a smaller and entirely owned room of her own. That is the only kind of survival in the system she once served that the system cannot eventually take back. If you watched all the way to this part of the story, do me a favor. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next 1980s story I am working on. Then drop a comment and tell me, did Carolyne Roehm choose silence? Or did the room she built leave her no other choice? I read every reply.